السلام عليكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So I'm always excited when I am asked to talk about this subject because I get to talk about a story that I always loved growing up. And it's a story that begins with a mother duck looking proudly at all the beautiful ducklings that had just hatched. But while she did, she noticed that there was one that was different. It was large and not at all like the others. Soon that duck came to be known as the ugly duckling. It was different and didn't quite fit. When God created humanity, there were men, and then there were some who were not at all like the rest. They were women. They couldn't run as fast, and they cried way too much. Those women spent their whole lives wondering, were they just bad copies of men? Am I as a woman that ugly duckling? Am I just a bad copy of the standard? Well, no. Allah tells me that I'm a swan. See, I'm different than men, but it's meant to be that way. And the reason why I love this story so much is because it teaches that being beautiful and having worth does not mean that you have to be just like everyone else. It teaches that our standard and our worth and our honor as women does not come from our sameness to men, but comes from our distinctiveness to men. Now, the worth of a woman and the definition of what is a woman and what is a man has been defined in many ways throughout history and across societies. Now, one of the ways in which, unfortunately, society has defined what it means to be a woman or to be a successful woman is, unfortunately, it has a lot to do with how she looks. And so we live in a society right now where women are very much defined by the way they look, and how successful they are is determined by how attractive and how beautiful they can be for men. Now, Allah comes and tells us as women that we don't need to fall to that standard. We don't need to be an object, because as women, Allah tells us that our worth is defined by our relationship with Him and not by our relationship with any of His creation. And so as women, we're told by Allah, as Muslim women, we're told by Allah to actually cover ourselves. And by covering ourselves, we're covering up what's irrelevant, and that's our body, and that's our external beauty. Because what really matters in our self-worth is our character, right? And our relationship with Allah. Now, this has been, criticized. This objectification of women in this hypersexualized society has been criticized by Western feminists. But the problem is that in trying to break out of this, what has happened is that Western feminism comes into it and tries to liberate women, right, from this bondage of being a sex object. But there's one very serious problem in this so-called liberation, and that is that God has been taken out of the equation. Okay? So what happens now is that the way to liberate a woman is by making her like a man. What do I mean by that? Well, you need a standard of some sort. You need something to measure your self-worth, okay? And if you take God out of the equation, that thing to measure your worth becomes that which is in power, right? So what happened over time is that in trying to liberate men, ironically, women began to think that they should mimic men, that they should be more like a man, and therefore they will be more honored and more dignified. And what are some examples of that? Well, for example, things which are usually considered uniquely feminine, or more to do with feminine traits, have been considered a degradation. Okay, so for example, to say that someone is emotional or sensitive, I mean, it's like you're insulting them. Right? This has become an insult, even though the Prophet ﷺ defined these things differently. For example, we in society have defined that to cry is a measure of weakness, right? And that to not show emotion means that you're strong. And yet, the Prophet ﷺ has defined it very differently. The Prophet ﷺ, when he cried after the death of his son, people looked at him, and the men, they also kind of thought that was strange, and they were taken aback by this. And they said to him, they were like, what is this? Like, what are you doing? And the Prophet ﷺ explained that emotion that he was showing was actually connected to rahmah, to mercy. Now, if you think about rahmah is one of the greatest attributes of God. It's a godly attribute, which is mercy. And so he's actually connected this thing with this very, very honorable quality of mercy. And yet we in society come and redefine it as weakness. And yet, ironically, the things which we consider as strength are what the Prophet ﷺ defined as weakness. And I'll give you an example. Usually in our society, men are taught, growing up, boys are taught, that they're not supposed to show emotion. But there's one emotion which boys are allowed to show, and it's considered manly and acceptable. And that's the emotion of anger. So boys basically are taught that everything they feel has to be suppressed, but the only externalization of emotion that you are allowed to show and still be manly is anger. And yet, the Prophet ﷺ explained that this is actually a sign of weakness. When the Prophet ﷺ asked his companions, who is the really strong person? And his companions, they thought a lot in a very similar way that we do. And they said, well, it's the one who can wrestle the best. So they thought about it in terms of physical strength. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, it's the one who can control themselves in the fit of anger. And so here the Prophet ﷺ is defining that lack of control of your anger is actually a sign of weakness. On the other hand, he defines showing of emotion such as crying as a sign of mercy. So look at how we flip the script in terms of our own definitions. Another example of something that's looked down upon, especially if it's seen in men, and it's considered, not masculine, is the expression of emotion in terms of affection. So the Prophet ﷺ, one time he was, showing affection to one of his children, and another one of the Arab men came and, he was trying to boast, I guess, about his own masculinity by saying that I have all these children and I never kissed them and I never hugged them and I never showed any emotion to them. And the Prophet ﷺ's response is very beautiful. He says, what can I do if mercy has been taken out of your heart? So again, this is another definition that we have of what it is to be a man, right? What it means, what masculinity means, and yet the Prophet ﷺ explains this as being a lack of mercy. To show no emotion, he connects it to a lack of mercy. Whereas to show emotion in terms of crying, he connects that to mercy. So this is interesting because, again, our definitions are completely opposite. Now, how does that relate to how we interact together? Well, the interesting thing is, because we as women, we start to actually internalize these definitions too. So what we start to think is that unless we are also aggressive and, stoic, we will be taken advantage of. And so we as women, we kind of try to fall into this definition of what it means to be a strong person as well. And so in doing that, we actually end up shooting ourselves in the foot. And I'll tell you why. Because when men and women interact, and this is what the experts find, is that the primary need that they find for a man is to feel respected. Okay? And the primary need for a woman is to feel cared for or loved. And so what these experts have found is that the conflict that happens between men and women can basically be broken down into this formula, which they call the crazy cycle. And what that crazy cycle is that, and this is interactions between men and women on any level. So whether it's in the context of marriage, or it's in the context of Islamic work, or the context of within a family, whatever. But generally, this is what happens. And the crazy cycle this is the conflict. When conflict happens, it usually can be broken down to this, that one of them, so for example, a man might do something, or a brother might do something that is interpreted by the sister or the woman in whatever context as being uncaring. So he does something that feels like it's kind of insensitive, okay? Now, what does a woman do in response? Well, our knee-jerk reaction also happens to be the absolute worst reaction. Our knee-jerk reaction is to react with attitude, right? It's to react kind of in an aggressive sort of, almost like disrespectful way, okay? And the root of that, though, is that we feel uncared for, or we feel unloved, or we feel that someone has done something insensitive to us. So we react with harshness. Okay? Now, what does that do? Well, now when you're reacting with disrespect, you're now depriving the man of his primary need, which is to feel respected. And so how does he react? He reacts by being even more unloving, and even more uncaring, and even more harsh. And so now you are in this crazy cycle, because when a woman feels that, she reacts with even more disrespect. So the question is, how do we break this cycle? And what they say is that there's something called unconditional respect and unconditional love, or care, or consideration, depending on the context, of course. So what does that mean in terms of Islamic work? What does that mean in terms of a marriage or a relationship? Well, what it means is that regardless of whether or not we feel that someone is being insensitive, if we respond, especially when dealing with a man, if a woman responds with unconditional respect, meaning that she remains respectful, that will actually trigger a man to be more caring and more loving. And this is really interesting, because if you look at the advice that the Prophet ﷺ gives, it exactly follows this formula. So obviously the Prophet ﷺ is going to give us the advice that is most helpful, right, to have a successful relationship. So when when the Prophet, Allah and His Prophet, command the women or advise the women, most of the advice that's given to women is not to love men, is not to love their husbands. Why do you think that is? Well, because women, love comes naturally, right? We give love. This is something that we naturally, and we are very familiar with the concept of unconditional love. However, there's something we're not that familiar with, and that is respect. We do not understand the concept of unconditional respect. We as women feel like, well, you gotta deserve my respect. You gotta earn my respect, right? So if you're treating me bad, I'm not gonna respect you, right? Now that's the problem right there, because when we take on that attitude, we're only going to get more and more harsh treatment. It's like this knee-jerk reaction. So the Prophet ﷺ comes to women, and he recommends to women what? Respect your husbands, right? Obey your husbands. So the emphasis is on respect. Okay? Now, when Allah and His Messenger talk to men, when the Prophet ﷺ is advising men on how to treat women, what is the emphasis? The emphasis is in terms of kindness and love. So the Prophet ﷺ is telling men, be kind with your wives, right? Be caring, don't be harsh with your wives. And in one hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says that a woman was created from a bent rib, right? And he says, and this is a really deep hadith, he says that if you try to straighten it, you'll break it. But if you leave it as it is, you'll enjoy it. So what does that mean? Well, women are a certain way, and they're created that way, right? We didn't bend our own rib. We didn't make the rib bent ourselves. But we're created with a certain nature from God. And if you're going to go and try to change that nature, guess what? You're going to break it. You're not going to be successful with that woman. But if you accept her as she is, and accept her nature as it is, you will be successful. And so the idea here is that if you treat her with kindness and you treat her with love, and that unconditional love commandment is more given to men. Because men, on the other hand, have the idea usually, on the mirror of the women, is that I'm only going to be kind and loving to my wife when she's respectful to me. But so long as she shows me disrespect, I'm not going to show her love. And this is also a formula for failure, because the more that a man shows harshness to a woman, the more disrespectful she tends to be. Now, one really beautiful example of this is the example of Umar radiallahu anh. Now, when you think about in your mind who is the most manly man there is that you can just think about, like big masculine man, you think of usually Umar ibn al-Khattab. This is one of the most manly men you can think of, right? Now, if you think about, this is the man who this story stars, okay? So what happened is then when Umar radiallahu anh was Khalifa, there was one of the men in the society who wanted to come to him to complain about his wife. Now, I guess the women of Ansar were kind of strong, right? So he was gonna go complain about his wife, and then when he got close to Umar radiallahu anhu's house, he heard Umar's wife raising her voice to him, and he kind of turned around to go back. And Umar radiallahu anh came out and said, asked him why he came, and he said, well, actually I was coming to complain about the same problem that you have. So Umar radiallahu anh at that time told him something very wise, and he said that my wife, she cooks for me, she cleans for me, she takes care of me, and she takes care of, my home, right? Can I not overlook it or be tolerant when she's, raising her voice or she's talking in a disrespectful way? Now the point here, there's a really deep lesson here, and that is that Umar radiallahu anh understood that to be a man, I mean, you definitely wouldn't call him unmasculine, right? That to be a man does not mean that you need to be harsh, right? He understood that the actual strength that the Prophet ﷺ talked about was in controlling your anger, not letting your anger control you. So, if you look at, again, this advice that we can look at from the Prophet ﷺ, from Allah, that's where we should be getting our sense of self-worth and what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man. And until we can use that as our standard, rather than society, rather than popular culture, we're never going to be successful. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم سبحانك الله وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.